The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, its rhythmic sound filling the empty spaces of the dive bar at the edge of town. The dim lighting cast long shadows, and the air smelled like old whiskey and stale secrets. Elara, the bartender, wiped down the counter with a cloth that had seen better days, her eyes flickering from one silent patron to the next. She had been here long enough to know when something was amiss. And tonight, something was. A man in a pristine jacket walked through the door, his polished shoes clicking on the worn floorboards. His posture was too straight, his eyes too calm, and the way he looked at her spoke of a story buried too deep to ask about. He ordered a whiskey, neat, without hesitation. Not the kind of drink you order when you're trying to forget, but the kind you drink when you have something to prove. But it wasn't the newcomer that made her nervous. It was the man who followed, the one with the weathered jacket and the dangerous grin. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something that smelled like trouble. A history, perhaps. And when he called the well-dressed man by Dame James, Elara's instincts kicked in. She had seen enough to know that this wasn't a simple reunion. It wasn't a friendly catch-up. A storm was coming, but in a town like this, a storm didn't announce itself. It just arrived, silent and swift. As the two men stepped outside, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance like a warning they couldn't ignore. Elara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next would change everything. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it comes knocking. And when it does, it's never as quiet as the night. The night was still young, but the dive bar at the edge of town was already steeped in a quiet kind of melancholy. A handful of patrons sat hunched over their drinks, lost in their own worlds. The flickering neon sign outside cast an occasional weak glow through the dirty windows, and the musty air inside carried the scent of old wood, spilled beer, and forgotten secrets. Elara, the bartender, had been working the closing shift for years, and she had learned to read people like an old book, tattered at the edges but still holding stories within. She had seen all sorts of souls come through the door. The regulars were easy to read, people who sought solace in the bottom of a glass with nothing but regret to keep them company. But tonight, something felt different. The energy in the bar was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Maybe it was just the quiet of the night, or maybe it was the newcomer who had just walked in. A man, dressed in a tailored jacket and polished shoes, stepped into the bar. His presence contrasted sharply with the dull ambiance of the place. He wasn't like the regulars, no sagging shoulders, no distant gaze that spoke of regrets drowned in whiskey. He looked too polished for this part of town, too clean for a place like this. His hair was combed back neatly, his jacket pristine, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that only a man who was used to being in control could possess. He approached the bar, and without a word, took a seat right in front of Elara. She didn't flinch, but she could feel her instincts kicking in. She had seen all kinds of people in this place, but this man, something was off about him. He nodded at her, but his eyes were watchful, almost like he was studying her. "What'll it be?" she asked, drying a glass with an old rag. His voice was steady, yet something about it sent a small shiver down her spine. "Whiskey, neat." Elara poured the drink without hesitation, sliding the glass across the counter toward him. The man took it, examining it for a brief moment before lifting it to his lips. He took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the burn, then looked up at her. There was something in his gaze that made Elara feel like he was measuring her. "This place is quiet," he finally said, his tone casual, but there was a hint of something deeper lurking underneath. "Depends on the night," Elara responded, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. "But yeah, not many people around this time of week. Not many looking for conversation either." He smirked slightly, his eyes glinting with amusement. "And yet you're talking to me." Elara didn't smile back. "You don't look like the type to drink alone in a place like this. So, what's your story?" The man exhaled through his nose. A small, almost imperceptible shake of his head as he looked into his glass. "Let's just say I'm passing through." Elara studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "People don't just pass through this town. You either belong here or you're running from something." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Maybe a bit of both. Before Elara could press him for more, the bell above the door jingled, cutting through the quiet tension in the air. Another man had walked in. This one was much rougher around the edges. His leather jacket was worn, his beard unkempt, and there was a dangerous edge to his demeanor. His eyes scanned the room quickly, his gaze locking onto the well-dressed man at the counter. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a sinister smirk. Elara tensed. She had seen enough trouble in this place to recognize the signs. The newcomer was trouble, the kind that showed up unannounced and brought chaos with it. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her. The two. Rough man approached slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on prey. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes never leaving the well-dressed man. "Didn't expect to see you here," the rough man said, his voice thick with something between amusement and menace. The well-dressed man didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He simply took another sip of his whiskey. Didn't expect to be seen. Elara glanced between them, the tension in the air thickening. She didn't like where this was heading, not one bit. She had seen old debts settled in blood before, and she wasn't about to let it happen under her roof. She stepped in before the situation could escalate. "I don't care what history you two have," she said firmly, meeting the rough man's eyes with a calm, measured gaze. "But if you start trouble in my bar, you're both out, got it?" The rough man grinned, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "No trouble, sweetheart. Just catching up with an old friend." Elara's eyes never left his. "That's what I'm worried about." James, the well-dressed man, finished his drink and set the glass down gently on the counter. He turned toward Elara, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. It was a silent exchange, one that spoke volumes without a single word. He was thanking her, she realized. Thanking her for stepping in, for keeping the peace. Then he turned back to the rough man. "Not here," he said. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an underlying steel to it. "If you have something to say to me, we take it outside." The rough man's smirk widened, a dangerous gleam flashing in his eyes. "Fine by me." Without another word, both men stood, heading for the door. Elara watched them go, a knot forming in her stomach. She had no idea what kind of ghosts James carried with him. But something told her that whatever happened outside wouldn't end cleanly. She could feel it in her bones. She sighed, wiping down the counter with a practiced hand, though her thoughts were far from the simple task at hand. The night was far from over. Outside, the cold air hit them immediately, biting at their skin as the tension between James and the rough man grew thicker. It was like standing on the edge of a razor blade. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. The rough man stood a few feet away, his hands in his jacket pockets as he sized James up. There was something in his eyes, something dark, predatory. "You've been running a long time," the rough man said, his voice low, almost amused. "Thought you'd be smarter than to stop." James didn't flinch. He slipped a hand into his own jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of the hidden weapon there. He didn't need to look at it to know it was there. It had been with him for a long time now. It had always been with him ever since that day, the day he had made a decision that would change everything. "Maybe I got tired of running," James said quietly, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it that couldn't be ignored. The rough man chuckled, the sound dark and low. "You always did like to make things difficult." A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The wind howled through the alleyway, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. The sound was like a warning, a reminder that time was running out. Whatever happened next, It would be now or never. James took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the horizon. He had always known this day would come. He just didn't expect it to find him here, in a forgotten town, in a bar that had somehow become a sanctuary. The sirens grew louder, closer. The rough man did the same, his posture stiffening, sensing the change in the air. "Guess we're out of time," the rough man muttered, his smirk vanishing as the reality of the situation set in. "Shame. I was hoping for a little more fun." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made up his mind. The decision had been made for him the moment he stepped into that bar. Whatever had been buried in the past, whatever ghosts had been haunting him, it was all coming to a head tonight. The storm had already begun. There was no turning back now. He turned and started walking back toward the bar, the rough man watching him with narrowed eyes. Elara was still behind the counter, her gaze fixed on the window. When James stepped back inside, their eyes met. Her expression unreadable, yet there was something in it that told him she understood. She had known what was happening before he had even made his move. He took a seat back at the bar, his muscles stiff but his mind oddly calm. Elara didn't say a word as she poured him another whiskey. She slid the glass across the counter to him without hesitation. James took it, savoring the warmth as it spread through him, his mind drifting for just a moment. Outside, the world was closing in. But for now, in this quiet bar, James had a moment of peace. And sometimes, that was enough.